They say buying land is about freedom, about open skies, quiet mornings, and finally living without someone telling you what you can or can't do. That's exactly what I was chasing when I bought the ranch. Just a stretch of dirt road outside a strict HOA boundary, a weathered fence line, and enough space to breathe again. No rules. No neighbors peering over the hedges. No constant notes slipped under the door complaining about paint colors or trash cans. Just peace. Or so I thought. The first sign that something was wrong happened the night I drove out to the property for the very first time. The sky was fading into that soft blue before darkness fully arrives, and the air felt thick with stillness. As I rolled through the old entrance, headlights cutting across tall grass, I realized someone was standing near the fence line, watching, not waving, not calling out, just staring. By the time I parked and stepped out, they were gone. I shook it off as nerves. New place jitters. That's what people call it. But deep down, something didn't sit right. Over the next week, I learned about her. The neighbor everyone referred to as the HOA woman. Even though my property wasn't technically under their control, she lived inside the community line, just beyond my land. Apparently, she'd made a habit of monitoring what went on near the boundary, acting as if the HOA rules somehow stretched past the signs posted at the entrance. Most people didn't push back. It was easier to comply than to argue. But I hadn't moved here to be controlled again. Soon enough, the notes started showing up on my truck windshield. Warnings about unauthorized access. Complaints about dust drifting toward the neighborhood. Messages demanding compliance with community standards. Even though I wasn't part of those standards at all, I ignored them at first. I kept telling myself I was being paranoid. Then the confrontations came. She stormed across the boundary more than once, shouting about property values and order, pointing at my land like I'd personally dragged chaos into her world. Her anger didn't match the situation. Felt bigger than the complaints, sharper than annoyance. Like this was personal. That's when I decided to install the gate. Not to provoke anyone, not to start a fight, but to protect the one thing I thought I'd come out here to claim: privacy. A simple steel gate across the old access road, legally placed well inside my property line. No locks against neighbors. No intention to block anyone who belonged here. Just a clear message. This land was not open for harassment anymore. The gate went up in a single afternoon. Quiet, clean, official. And that's when everything changed. That evening, as the sun sank behind the hills, I heard shouting echo across the dirt road. Then frantic footsteps. Then the metallic clang of someone yanking at the bars. I stepped out onto the porch just in time to see her standing on the other side of the gate, furious, face red with disbelief, testing the handle like it had personally betrayed her. And the look in her eyes wasn't simple anger anymore. It was something closer to panic. She didn't notice me at first. She was too busy tugging at the gate, rattling the metal like the sound alone might force it open. Her heels kicked up dust against the gravel, breath quick and uneven. This wasn't the reaction of someone mildly inconvenienced. This looked closer to desperation. When she finally saw me standing on the porch, our eyes met, and for a second her anger flickered into something else. Fear, maybe, or shame. It vanished just as fast. "You can't do this," she shouted, pointing at the gate like it was a crime scene. "This road has always been open. Everyone uses it." I stayed calm. I explained what I already knew inside. The gate sat completely on my ranch property, outside the HOA boundary, and I wasn't breaking any rules. I hadn't blocked any public roads. I'd only secured a private entrance that was being used without permission. All facts, all legal. Yet facts didn't matter to her. She accused me of disrespecting the community, of threatening their lifestyle, of trying to isolate myself like I had something to hide. The words cut deeper than I expected. I drove 3 hours to inspect the place, poured my savings into the purchase, and spent months dreaming of something simple. A life where I wasn't constantly under someone else's judgment. And now, standing there with dust on my boots, I found myself feeling like I'd walked straight from one cage into another. Over time, I began learning small pieces of her backstory from other nearby residents. Years earlier, she'd been one of the founding HOA volunteers, deeply involved, fiercely proud of maintaining standards. They said the organization slowly became her identity. As board members rotated out, she stayed. She wasn't elected anymore, but she kept acting as a self-appointed enforcer, memorizing bylaws most people had forgotten even existed. Control gave her purpose, and losing it clearly rattled her more than anyone realized. What no one could explain was why my property triggered her so badly. Every evening after the gate went up, I'd notice her car slowing along the outer fence, headlights sweeping past the posts. Some nights, I'd hear footsteps near the boundary, never crossing, always stopping right at the invisible line. I never saw anyone clearly, just shadows retreating whenever I stepped outside. The silence afterward felt heavy, like the land itself was holding its breath. I checked the property records again. Everything was clean. No old easements. No shared driveways. No hidden agreements tying my ranch to the HOA. Legally, I was free. So why did it feel like eyes were always watching? What unsettled me most wasn't her anger anymore. It was the way that anger kept slipping into something uncomfortable, something almost personal. This wasn't about the gate or community rules. It felt like I had unknowingly blocked off more than just a road. One night, I found fresh footprints along the gravel by the fence line, stopping inches from the gate. No attempt to cross, just standing there, waiting. I stayed on the porch with the light off, suddenly aware that the ranch I bought for peace had become a stage for a confrontation I hadn't agreed to step into. And as I glanced toward the dark road beyond the fence, a single thought kept replaying in my mind. What exactly does that gate keep her from reaching? The footprints didn't leave my mind. I kept replaying the shape of them in the gravel, the way they stopped so precisely at the gate, toes pointed forward, like someone had stood there for a while instead of simply passing by. I considered installing cameras, but the thought unsettled me. If I started watching her, didn't that make me no different from what she was already doing? Still, the tension followed me everywhere. Word spread fast through the nearby community. A few people began slowing by my ranch with curious glances, some offering friendly waves, others staring like they were choosing sides in a quiet conflict they didn't fully understand. One older neighbor from inside the HOA finally pulled over one afternoon. He leaned across the passenger window and spoke low, like he didn't want to be overheard. He told me I wasn't the first person she'd targeted, just the first who didn't back down. According to him, whenever someone challenged her authority, she escalated until they gave up or moved away. Petitions, complaints, calls to township offices. She never crossed the line directly, but she always knew how to walk it closely enough to make people uncomfortable. Most eventually caved, not because she was right, but because fighting her felt exhausting. The moral question dug into me. Was I being stubborn for the sake of pride, or was I defending something bigger, the right to live freely on land I legally owned? Part of me wondered if the quieter path would be to remove the gate and dissolve the tension. Peace could be cheap, but it would also be borrowed, built on giving someone else control over my choices again. Meanwhile, the strange things kept happening. Mail meant for me vanished twice before arriving days later. A property inspection notice appeared in my inbox with no confirmed sender. Even the ranch supply store clerk asked if I was the guy creating problems near the HOA, before awkwardly changing the subject. None of it was proof, just a creeping spiderweb of pressure that made everyday life feel watched and weighted. At night, the road outside my fence no longer felt empty. Engines idled where no cars should linger. Once, a beam of headlights stopped directly at the gate for nearly 10 minutes before pulling away. I never went out to check. I stayed inside, stomach knotted, wondering if restraint was courage or cowardice. And then there was the woman herself. I caught a glimpse of her one afternoon on the edge of the boundary, standing perfectly still. No yelling this time. No threats. Just staring toward the house. Her face looked different in that moment. Less furious, more strained. When our eyes met across the distance, she didn't turn away. The silence between us stretched thin and uncomfortable. It felt like seeing someone who wanted to say something but didn't know how or couldn't. Later, in town, I overheard two people speaking about her name in hushed tones. One mentioned an old legal fight involving property access years back. Another said she'd lost more than she ever admitted. No one would explain further. The conversations died the moment I came close. That was when I started to feel the story I'd created in my head unravel. This wasn't just a neighbor angry about boundaries. Something in her past had collided with my gate, and whatever it was, it still wasn't finished reaching the surface. The tension stopped feeling distant. It followed me now into the grocery store, onto supply runs, through every quiet moment on the ranch. My phone buzzed with unknown numbers that hung up when I answered. Notices appeared online about town hearings I didn't remember requesting. Nothing was solid enough to fight back against. Just enough to make me feel off balance. One evening, a folded envelope waited on my porch. No stamp, no address. Inside was a photocopy of an old zoning map, yellowed and creased, with my ranch marked in red ink. A handwritten note glared from the corner. This access can't be blocked. My hands shook as I unfolded it again, studying the faded road lines. The route she claimed was highlighted like a wound. A thin path cutting across my land, labeled in tiny type I almost missed. Old auxiliary service lane, closed. Closed. Not active. Not public. But why would someone still be fighting for something that didn't exist anymore? I drove to the county office the next morning. A clerk pulled the dusty file and confirmed it. The lane was permanently retired decades ago when the highway realigned. Legally dead. The story should have ended right there. But then the clerk hesitated. Strange, she said quietly, scrolling through her monitor. Someone tried requesting an access review last month. Who? I asked. She paused again. I can't release that. Of course she couldn't. That night the fence alarm chirped softly. Once. Then silence. I eased onto the porch without turning on the lights. The gate stood closed beneath the moon, but someone waited on the far side. A shadow moved. A figure stepped forward. Her. This time she didn't touch the bars or shout. She stood perfectly still, the moon outlining the tense angle of her shoulders. You're making a mistake, she said, voice steady instead of screaming. Withheld emotion made it worse. Some paths shouldn't be sealed. What path? I called. She didn't respond. Instead, she raised her phone, turning the screen outward. For a single second, light flashed across the fence. An image too quickly replaced for me to clearly see. It was here before you, she whispered, and it matters more than you know. Her words echoed long after she turned away and disappeared down the dark roadside. Sleep didn't come. I couldn't shake the unanswered questions. The zoning map, the access request, her sudden shift from rage to warning. And that image, whatever it showed, felt like the missing piece of a puzzle I hadn't seen until too late. The next morning, mud tracks appeared along the outer fence line. Tire tracks this time, fresh, leading directly toward the sealed gate. My phone buzzed as I stood over them. A message from an unknown number. Tonight, you'll understand why she can't let that gate stay closed. The message sat on my phone like a ticking clock. I didn't reply. I didn't tell anyone. I spent the rest of the day pacing the ranch, replaying her words over and over. Some paths shouldn't be sealed. The phrase didn't sound like a threat anymore. It sounded like a warning. Just before sunset, a dusty SUV rolled up the dirt road and stopped near the outer fence. A man stepped out, clipboard in hand, wearing a county inspection badge. He introduced himself politely and explained there had been a formal complaint requesting immediate verification of potential obstruction to historical access routes. My stomach dropped. The timing felt too perfect. As he walked the perimeter, measuring distances and snapping photos of the gate, I stayed quiet, answering questions carefully. Everything I'd already verified said I was in the clear, but doubt crept in anyway, not about legality but motive. Why now? Who suddenly reignited a case over a road officially closed decades ago? The inspector paused near the gate. You know, he said casually, this request came from someone claiming direct personal loss, not the HOA. An individual resident. I knew exactly who he meant. Later that evening, I watched her house across the boundary as dusk deepened. Lights flickered on, then off. A silhouette moved behind a window curtain, pacing. She wasn't celebrating. She wasn't calm. She looked unsettled. That's when town gossip suddenly made sense. Whispered references to an old dispute, something she'd lost years ago. I searched public court records until I found it. A dismissed civil claim from nearly 2 decades back involving access rights through undeveloped land. Her family had owned a small property parcel that once depended on the auxiliary lane, the same one now closed for delivery access. When the county rerouted and decommissioned the lane, their business folded. The land was sold. Her father had never financially recovered, and she blamed the closure. But the twist came when I read deeper. The claim wasn't filed by her father. It was filed in her name. She hadn't been protecting some HOA principle all these years. She'd been nursing a personal wound, one she'd never let go of. The gate on my ranch didn't just seal off land. It revived the moment she felt everything had been taken from her. Suddenly her behavior shifted in my mind. The obsession, the monitoring, the anger that bordered on panic. She wasn't fighting me. She was fighting history. Yet my sympathy froze when my phone vibrated again. A forwarded text from an unknown source. She didn't file alone. A second attachment followed. A blurred photo taken near the county office earlier that morning. 2 figures stood talking beside the building. The woman I'd been dealing with, and the elderly neighbor who had quietly warned me weeks ago. Trust cracked under my feet. The man who'd told me she targets people had been working with her, or trying to manipulate me from the beginning. I stared at the photo until the screen burned into my eyes. On my porch, with the locked gate between the dark road and my home, the story twisted into something darker than a feud over boundaries. This wasn't random. This was planned. And as night settled over the ranch, I began to wonder, who exactly had I been protecting, and who had been setting the trap? I didn't sleep that night. The image of the woman standing beside the old neighbor at the county office looped through my mind over and over. By dawn, I'd made a decision. I wouldn't wait for whatever tonight was supposed to bring. I wanted answers. I drove into town and requested the full archived file related to the auxiliary access lane. It took hours of paperwork and quiet pressure before an older records clerk finally slid a thick folder across the counter. When I opened it, the smell of dust and time hit me like a warning. The map inside wasn't the same one mailed to me. This version showed something different. A narrow footpath branched off the decommissioned road, a tiny connector never officially removed from the registry. Not a vehicle route, a pedestrian-only easement that crossed my ranch and ended near the very fence where she had always stood. My chest tightened. The path wasn't legal for development access, but it still carried limited pass-through status. Rarely used, forgotten, yet still technically active. Her problem was never the gate itself. It was that the gate blocked even foot traffic across what she believed was her last remaining legal thread to the past. That evening, I waited at the gate with the paperwork in hand. She came just after sunset, alone this time. No shouting, no threats. Only that strained look again, the one I'd seen weeks earlier across the fence. "You found it," she said quietly. I nodded. She told me everything then. That path had once led to the tiny roadside produce stand her family ran. After the main lane closed, that foot access had become the only remaining way customers could reach them by cutting through the open land that later became portions of my ranch. Over time, fewer people came. Business died. Her father blamed the closure. The debt crushed him long before age ever could. "I couldn't stand watching it disappear twice," she whispered. "Once to the county, once to your gate. The anger, the confrontations, the obsession, it had all been fueled by unresolved grief buried beneath years of control. I thought that was the end of it. Then the older neighbor arrived. He walked slowly down the road, shame written in his posture. When he admitted the truth, the real twist surfaced. He wasn't helping her. He had used her. Years ago, he'd attempted to annex part of my property into the HOA boundary for development profit. The request failed, But the footpath easement remained a small technical risk. When he saw me by the land, he reached out to her, reigniting her trauma and encouraging confrontation, hoping conflict would force a review that might reopen possibilities for himself. She had been manipulated as much as I had. The trap wasn't hers. It was his. The solution ended up being painfully simple and human. We worked with the county to formally relocate the footpath around the edge of my property, keeping public pass-through intact without crossing my ranch or requiring gate access.
No lawsuits.
No drama.
No HOA overreach.
When the paperwork finalized days later, she came one last time. Not angry, not pleading, just quiet. "Thank you for not turning this into what he wanted," she said. And as she walked away down the redirected path, free of fences for the first time in decades, I realized the gate had never been about keeping someone out. It had been about revealing who was really plotting behind the bars all along. Here is prompt 6, climax and resolution, 500 words, continued and completed in the style you requested. I didn't sleep that night. The image of the woman standing beside the old neighbor played on repeat in my head. Two people I thought I understood, now blurred into one unanswered question. By sunrise, I was done waiting. If the gate had become the center of something bigger than a neighbor dispute, I needed to see the truth for myself. I went straight to the county records office. After hours of digging, an archivist brought out a thick, dust-coated binder labeled with the same access route I'd received in the anonymous envelope. But this version held something new. On one faded map, a thin dotted line branched off the closed auxiliary lane, a pedestrian-only easement that crossed right where my gate stood now. Not a vehicle road, not a business route, but still technically legal foot access. Forgotten, outdated, yet never officially erased. When realization hit, my chest tightened. The gate hadn't just blocked her physically. It symbolized the last fragile tie to something personal. That evening, I waited near the gate with the paperwork in my hands. She arrived just before sunset, no shouting this time.
No accusations.
"You found it," she said quietly. I nodded. She finally told me the story she hadn't known how to explain. Decades ago, her family ran a small roadside produce stand that relied on foot traffic after the main lane closed. Customers cut across what later became my property to reach it. When visibility dropped, sales collapsed. Debt took over. Her father lost everything, then his health. She never blamed the county. She blamed the land. She blamed the closure. She blamed herself for not stopping it. So when I installed the gate, it didn't feel like boundaries anymore. It felt like history sealing shut all over again. Just when I thought I finally understood her pain, a third presence emerged from the dark road. The older neighbor. His voice trembled when he spoke. He admitted he hadn't warned me out of kindness. Years earlier, he tried to push HOA expansion into my property to develop the borderland for profit. When that failed, the lingering easement became a technical vulnerability. He knew she carried unresolved grief about the path, and quietly encouraged her to fight me, hoping pressure would force a municipal review and reopen access rights he could exploit. She hadn't been the mastermind. She had been emotionally used. So had I. We ended the standoff with paperwork, not lawsuits, relocating the pedestrian easement around the outer border of my ranch instead of cutting through it, preserving public access while removing conflict from my land. No HOA victory, no courtroom drama, just truth. And finally, closure. When the redirected route was confirmed days later, she returned one last time. Her voice was steady now. "Thank you for not letting this turn into something ugly." And as she followed the new path into the fading light, I realized something unexpected. The gate had never been about keeping her out. It had been about exposing the people who never wanted anyone free in the first place. The ranch felt different after everything settled. The dust road was still the same. The open fields still stretched toward the horizon. The gate still stood where I had placed it, strong, quiet, unmoving. But the tension that once hung in the air like an invisible storm cloud had finally lifted. The redirected footpath brought closure to what numbers and legal lines never could. The woman no longer circled the boundary or slowed past my fence. In town, I saw her once at the local cafe. No anger in her posture now. Just someone learning how to let go after holding on to old pain for far too long. Her story didn't end with winning or losing, only with release. The older neighbor avoided me completely. County filings confirmed what his silence already admitted. His development efforts were permanently denied. Any HOA expansion halted by newly clarified boundaries. Without the leverage he was hoping for, he faded into the ordinary rhythm of small-town anonymity. No confrontation was needed. The truth handled it quietly. As for me, I finally began to live the life I came here for. Morning coffee on the porch no longer tasted of stress. The quiet wasn't interrupted by shouting or phantom headlights at night. The gate transformed from a symbol of conflict into what it was always meant to be. A simple boundary protecting both privacy and peace. I stopped feeling like I had to defend my decision to buy a ranch outside the HOA. It was no longer about proving anything to anyone. The experience taught me something deeper than property rights or zoning disputes. Most battles aren't really about rules. They're about unresolved stories people carry inside them. Fear, loss, and regret have a way of masquerading as anger. And sometimes what looks like entitlement or control is really just grief with nowhere else to go. I learned my own flaw too. I had approached the situation convinced I was only protecting my space, without thinking how invisible past wounds can surface unexpectedly. Holding your ground doesn't mean abandoning empathy, and compassion doesn't mean surrendering what you worked for. Strength sits quietly between the two. The keywords that once defined this conflict, HOA restrictions, property boundaries, gated access, now seem smaller than what it ultimately became. A human story about control, memory, and learning when to open space instead of closing it. On my final evening reflecting on it all, I stood beside the gate as the sun burned orange across the fields. The latch rested untouched beneath my palm. I didn't need to lock it anymore. I locked nothing now except the reminder of what I overcame. As the breeze rolled through the tall grass, I whispered the lesson that reshaped everything. Freedom isn't about keeping others out. It's about building boundaries that let peace stay in. If the story moved you, challenged you, or reminded you of a time you had to stand your ground, let me know in the comments. Share your story, I read them all. And if you want more real-life suspense stories like this one, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss what comes next.